the 17th of April, 1943. The grey dawn off Lorient carried a bitter Atlantic wind, sharp enough to sting the face and sting the memory. The submarine pens, massive concrete caverns built by forced labour, shuddered with the echo of departing diesels. Inside one of them, U-123 waited like a lung before a breath. Oberleutnant Reinhard Hardigan, veteran of 2 successful patrols, stood on the conning tower as dockworkers unhooked the final shore cables. His men below worked in rhythmic silence, every motion rehearsed. The air smelled of oil, seawater, and stale bread. There was no ceremony left. No fanfare from the dockside bands that had once played in 41 when the Grey Wolves had been heroes. Now, the faces at the pens were hard and few mechanics, doctors, boys with notebooks. The war at sea had shifted, and even Hardigan felt it. He glanced once at the horizon, then ordered, "Klar zum Auslaufen," clear to depart. The twin diesels roared to life, coughing black smoke across the concrete ceiling. The massive blast doors of the Lorient pen opened, and U-123 eased forward into the cold Atlantic. Behind them, France's occupied coast receded under the morning fog. The patrol would last 6 weeks. Few expected all 6 to come home. By midday, the Bay of Biscay rolled under them like hammered steel. Hardigan leaned on the periscope housing, his cap tucked under his arm. "Depth in 1 hour," he said. The lookouts nodded and scanned the empty sky. Every commander knew. This stretch of sea, once a safe exit, had become a killing ground. Allied radar-equipped aircraft now prowled the skies, every wake risked a bomb. "Tarchen!" the klaxon sounded. The men ducked through the narrow hatches in quick succession. Within moments, U-123 slipped beneath the surface. The roar of the diesels gave way to the hum of the electric motors, softer but far more intimate. The sudden quiet was the kind that pressed on the skin. Inside, the temperature rose. Condensation beaded on metal and fell like cold rain. Each man could hear his own breath. The control room lights shifted from white to red, a ritual meant to preserve night vision, but which also gave the illusion of blood pulsing through the iron walls. The air grew heavy with sweat and carbon dioxide. The crew went about their routines with precision that bordered on superstition. Chief Engineer Oberleutnant, Inga, Wilhelm Schmidt adjusted gauges and murmured numbers that only he fully understood. Electrician Matrosen Jeffrey Keller wiped oil from his hands and stared at the depth gauge 18 meters, then 22. In the tiny radio room, Funkmart Kurt Behrens monitored bursts of static, coded messages sent from headquarters at Carnival. He copied the message in pencil, the stub trembling slightly with the motion of the boat. Blythe 4, 120, over 18, 43. To all boats operating West Biscay sector, Allied aircraft with radar reported at grid BE 6321. Avoid surfacing before midnight. Maintain radio silence. Donitz. Behrens tore the slip from his pad and handed it to Hardigan. The commander read it once, then tucked it into his logbook. "We'll go deeper," he said quietly. "And stay quiet." The helmsman nodded. The diving officer spun the wheel. The boat descended another 10 meters. The pressure increased, a slow, invisible hand tightening around the hull. Outside, the Atlantic muffled itself into stillness. The submarine moved through blackness where sunlight faded to memory. Schools of fish scattered before the shadow of steel. To the men, it felt as though the ocean itself was listening. There was no sound but the tick of gauges and the occasional drip of condensation. Someone whispered a prayer. Another man, a machinist named Hoffman, hummed under his breath, too quietly for words. "Feels like church down here," one of the younger sailors muttered. Hardigan overheard him. "It is," he said without turning. "This is where you meet God quietly." The words hung in the red air. Submarine morale remains satisfactory. Crews aware of increasing danger but steadfast. Reaffirmed Donitz's order. "The sea gives no quarter. We ask none." That phrase, "we ask none," circulated like a catechism. The men repeated it in letters home, in whispered jokes, in the spaces between fear and pride. Yet beneath it ran another truth. They all knew how many never came back. By April 1943, Allied code-breaking and air cover had turned the U-boat campaign into a slow massacre. The life expectancy of a German submariner was less than 6 weeks. But statistics never entered the control room. Only the air mattered, the air and the depth gauge. At 40 meters, the sound changed. It always did. Metal began to creak, a slow groan like a living thing. The crew froze. Then Hardigan spoke, voice calm and even. "She's just settling. Remember that sound. It's the sea reminding us who's in command." They smiled weakly, but no one laughed. The log recorded oxygen at 19%, carbon dioxide rising. Ventilation fans whirred faintly, barely moving the heavy air. Sweat ran down necks and dripped onto the deck plates. "Surface watch in 4 hours," Schmidt said. "Battery drain at 23%. Keep her steady," Hardigan replied. "We'll surface after dark." At 1900 hours, a dull thump echoed through the hull, then another. The crew froze. "Depth charges?" someone whispered. Hardigan listened, head tilted. It wasn't the sharp pattern of explosives, just the distant pounding of a ship's screws. Allied patrol, perhaps a destroyer sweeping the bay. "Hold course," he ordered. "Do not surface." The pounding faded, but no one moved for several minutes. Later, Hardigan wrote in his patrol diary, "Fear comes not from the explosions, but from the waiting. Each man's mind measures the distance to the surface and wonders if air is worth exposure." Night fell above them, though no one below could see it. In the control room, the clock's hands crawled past 2,300. Hardigan finally gave the word, "surface." The ballast tanks vented with a rumble like thunder underwater. The submarine rose slowly, breaking through the Atlantic with a hiss of bubbles and foam. The conning tower hatch opened, and the first wave of cold air rushed in. Men climbed up in silence. The stars stretched clear across the black dome of sky. Somewhere in the far distance, the faint flicker of a searchlight swept across the horizon, but too far to see them. Hardigan took a long breath. The air was sharp, metallic, alive. He let it out slowly and whispered, "For tonight, we live. Contact lost with you, 123 south of Bay of Biscay, presumed submerged for extended duration. Aircraft unable to locate. Probable destination, North Atlantic convoy lanes." The war moved on. To the Allied analysts, U-123 was a line of ink and coordinates. To the men inside, it was a floating world, an iron coffin that breathed, groaned, and prayed in the dark. Above them, the Atlantic rolled endlessly. Below them, silence pressed in from every side. And between, caught in that fragile layer of depth and air, they learned what it meant to exist where the ocean itself decided who was allowed to breathe. The ocean was both shield and grave, merciful in its silence, merciless in its honesty. Every dive was a promise. They would descend not just beneath the sea, but beneath the line between man and memory. The North Atlantic was a living entity, unpredictable and ruthless. By April 20, U-123 had reached the patrol sector west of the Bay of Biscay. The seas were slate grey, with waves cresting like jagged teeth. Even from the conning tower, the horizon appeared as a trembling line, the sky and water indistinguishable except for the occasional break of white spray. Hardigan noted it in his log. "The sea is patient, but it does not forgive mistakes." Below deck, the crew moved in near silent efficiency. Each man had a station, each man had a fear. For them, the submarine was more than a vessel. It was a mechanical womb, a cage, and a coffin all at once. The diesel engines had been stilled for the submerged journey, and the hum of electric motors replaced the reassuring roar above water. The only sound, apart from the occasional drip of condensation, was the creak of the hull. Hardigan studied the instruments, depth gauge steady at 60 meters, battery power dropping slowly, oxygen levels stable, but carbon dioxide creeping upward. In the tight confines, the air was almost palpably thick. Each breath was a conscious act. He could feel the tension of his crew, a nervous current running through the metal shell. "Periscope up," he ordered. The observation mast crept slowly above the waves. Through it, he could see the dim silhouette of a convoy in the distance. 4 freighters, heavily escorted. Anti-submarine warfare had improved dramatically in the past year. Depth charges were now more precise, and air patrols persistent. The men exchanged looks. Some had faced convoys before, others were on their first patrol in high-alert waters. All understood the stakes. A single misstep could mean instant death. Submarines operating in North Atlantic sectors must prioritize stealth. Do not surface unless essential. Allied air coverage has increased. Depth charges are now guided by hydrophones and radar. The boat must be considered a target at all times. The order was clear, but it did little to calm the nerves. Patrols that had once relied on surfacing at night to recharge batteries now risked detection by radar-equipped aircraft. U-boat commanders were forced to stay submerged longer, extending the limits of both machine and man. The first contact came on April 21. A patrolling Liberator bomber passed overhead. The crew of U-123 held their collective breath. The hydrophones picked up the distant drone of engines. Hardigan measured the depth and angle of the plane. "Maintain course. Silent running," he whispered. Electric motors hummed almost imperceptibly as the submarine adjusted its position. Time stretched. Minutes became hours. The bomber passed. No bombs fell. The men exhaled quietly. Relief mingled with fear. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Below deck, the claustrophobia intensified. The control room was now saturated with moisture, condensation dripping from the ceiling. Carbon dioxide levels had climbed noticeably. The familiar, sharp tang of recycled air filled the lungs. Men became irritable, voices clipped. Fatigue showed on every face, and the usual jokes that had once punctuated patrols were replaced by silence. "Feel it yet?" Schmidt asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Every breath," Hoffman muttered. He had started counting the seconds between breaths, a futile exercise to maintain control. Hardigan walked slowly down the narrow corridor. He knew the limits of human endurance better than most. U-boat crews, trained for months in confined conditions, could only hold their nerve for so long before panic set in. Submerged patrols were not just about strategy, they were a test of psychological fortitude. Allied forces report increased U-boat activity west of Biscay. Boats remain submerged longer, suggesting higher caution due to recent air patrol successes. Standard patrol routes indicate a shift from surface operations to extended submerged runs. The report confirmed Hardigan's own observations. He scribbled notes in his log. The Allies were closing the noose. The walls of the Atlantic felt smaller, every wave pressing against the hull like a hand attempting to squeeze confession from the boat itself. On April 23, disaster nearly struck. Hydrophones picked up the telltale pulse of depth charges. An escorting destroyer had picked up sonar echoes from U-123. The boat shuddered as a series of explosions reverberated through the hull. Paint flakes fell from the ceilings, instruments rattled violently. "Hold her steady!" Hardigan barked. "Do not surface!" The crew worked frantically, compensating for the minor shifts in buoyancy, stabilizing the vessel, ensuring the battery did not fail mid-dive. The pounding continued for 20 agonizing minutes before fading into distant echoes. The men were drenched in sweat, muscles trembling from the tension. Schmidt muttered under his breath, "Feels like the walls themselves are closing in." For the next few days, the patrol settled into a brutal rhythm, submerged during the day, silent running through the night. Batteries drained slowly but consistently. Oxygen became a constant concern. The crew began rationing air in a silent, unspoken negotiation with their environment. Even speaking too loudly was discouraged. Food became secondary to survival. The smell of damp metal and human sweat dominated. Condensation turned the walls into slippery mirrors. The men slept in shifts, never fully relaxed, always listening for the distant hum of engines or the sharp crack of depth charges. Hardigan wrote, "A submarine is not a vessel, but a living entity. It requires patience, obedience, and respect." The men understand this, but each hour underwater stretches the mind toward the edge. The ocean is patient, but man is not. We learned quickly that the ocean was indifferent. You could plan every maneuver, every attack, every dive, but the sea had its own rules. And if you violated them, it would remind you with force. The psychological strain of prolonged submerged operations was often underestimated by naval planners. For U-123, it became clear that the walls of the submarine were as much a threat as the Allied warships above. The combination of limited air, rising carbon dioxide, and constant vigilance created a tension that could snap in seconds. By April 28, the boat had made no attacks, conserving strength, monitoring convoys at a distance. The crew knew that each day spent submerged without surfacing brought them closer to the limits of endurance. Every breath counted. Every man measured the cost of exposure against the terror of suffocation. Extended submerged patrols are necessary to evade improved Allied detection. Commanders must weigh risk of oxygen depletion against risk of surface attack. This balance defines survival. The principle weighed heavily on Hardigan. Each decision carried consequences measured in human lives. Surfacing too early meant vulnerability to aircraft and destroyers. Remaining submerged too long risked hypoxia, carbon dioxide poisoning, and collapse. There was no safe option, only the lesser of two deadly risks. Night fell over the Atlantic on April 29. U-123 drifted silently at 70 meters. The stars above were invisible through clouds, leaving the submarine alone in its liquid tomb. Hardigan moved through the narrow corridors, checking each man, each instrument. There was no panic, only a quiet, simmering tension, the kind that gnawed at the edge of thought. They had survived the initial threat. But the North Atlantic had made its message clear. The walls were closing in. For U-123, the ocean was no longer a shield alone, it was a test of endurance, a relentless judge of every decision made beneath its surface. Each day brought them closer to understanding the unyielding limits of man and machine, and the terrifying reality that sometimes the sea's patient silence could be deadlier than its roar. The days beneath the waves were measured in shallow breaths and the faint, rhythmic creak of steel. By May 1, U-123 had been submerged for more than 72 hours. Diesel engines were silent, their fumes replaced by the stale, metallic tang of recycled air. The battery gauges were lower than anyone dared to admit aloud, and the depth meters seemed almost to pulse with menace in the dimly lit control room. Oberleutnant Reinhard Hardigan moved through the narrow corridors like a man treading the edge of a cliff. Each crew member he passed wore the same expression. Tense, wary, eyes flicking nervously toward instruments, listening for the slightest anomaly. The submarine was no longer merely a vessel. It was an iron cage, pressing inward from all sides. The first warning signs of prolonged submersion appeared in the form of restlessness. Crewmen began tapping boots and fingers against bulkheads. Small arguments erupted over trivial matters, rations, sleeping arrangements, the order of duty. Normally jovial voices had been reduced to whispers. Even laughter seemed dangerous, as though it might summon the wrath of the ocean above. Submerged operations extended beyond 48 hours. Crew behavior shows signs of psychological stress. Carbon dioxide levels increased, battery reserves diminishing. No enemy contact during current period. Commanders advised to maintain depth and silent running. The report reflected reality. Hardigan knew the numbers. Oxygen concentration declining slowly, carbon dioxide rising steadily. At 60 meters, the hull strained against the pressure of the North Atlantic, each meter downward increasing the risk of catastrophic failure. Yet surfacing was unthinkable. Allied aircraft patrolled relentlessly, radar sweeping for the slightest hint of a conning tower. To surface was to invite immediate death, To remain submerged was to invite a slower, suffocating one. At 0300 hours, Schmidt, the junior watch officer, pressed his forehead against the cold metal wall of the control room. The dull throb of the electric motors seemed louder than usual, echoing through his chest. "Every breath feels heavier," he muttered. Hoffman, stationed beside the periscope, nodded grimly. "It's not just the air, it's the walls. They're closing in on you, whether you notice it or not." Hardigan did not reply. Words were unnecessary. Each man understood the stakes. Their only path to survival was disciplined patience. But patience was a luxury in an environment designed to erode both body and mind. Extended submerged patrols require strict air management. Crew must monitor CO2 levels and limit physical exertion. Panic is a mortal threat. Command must enforce discipline. The submarine is a machine and a coffin. The line between the two is measured in hours of endurance. By May 3, the boat's interior had taken on a metallic dampness, condensation running down bulkheads like slow rivulets of ice. The men's skin felt clammy, clothes sticking uncomfortably. Sleep was broken, snatched in 15-minute intervals, interrupted by the hum of machinery or the distant echo of sonar pings. The psychological strain manifested in unexpected ways. Some men began muttering fragments of old songs, their voices barely audible. Others stared at walls for minutes on end, eyes glassy, tracing the patterns of rivets and seams. The iron cage was no longer just a metaphor. It was real, tangible, and every movement felt like an intrusion into its suffocating embrace. Allied convoys report increased sightings of submerged U-boats west of Bay of Biscay. Depth charges deployed have forced submarines to remain underwater for extended periods. Crews noted for visible signs of stress and delayed surface attacks. U-123 was acutely aware of these threats. The crew understood that detection above water would result in almost certain destruction. Depth charges could collapse sections of the hull, bombs from Liberators could pierce it outright. There was no margin for error, no safe haven above or below. The Atlantic had become both predator and executioner. Hardigan rotated through the control room, inspecting men, checking gauges. Oxygen levels had dropped another 0.5% since the previous day. Carbon dioxide monitors beeped softly, a constant reminder of the slow suffocation that awaited them if patience failed. "Ration your energy," he ordered. "Move slowly. Speak only when necessary." The men complied, but discipline was fraying. Fatigue, claustrophobia, and anxiety conspired to make each breath heavier than the last. There is a point in prolonged submersion when time loses meaning. Minutes blend into hours, hours into an endless grey. You hear things that aren't there. You see shadows that don't exist. The walls are no longer walls, they are entities pressing against you. To surface means death. To stay underwater means the same, only slower. This psychological liminality was exacerbated by the constant need for vigilance. Even while the boat was submerged, hydrophones scanned for propeller noise. Every creak of the hull, every drop of condensation, every whispered word was monitored. The men could not afford to relax, for a lapse in attention could bring the same swift destruction they had narrowly avoided days earlier. The next encounter came without warning. On May 4, sonar picked up the distant but unmistakable ping of Allied destroyers patrolling the convoy route. Hardigan ordered a silent turn, maintaining depth and speed. The hull groaned as the boat pivoted, the strain of submerged maneuvering made worse by depleted battery reserves. "Steady," he commanded. "Do not surface." Not for any reason. For the next 4 hours, the boat drifted, maneuvered, and lurked beneath the waves, the crew hyper-aware of each heartbeat, each inhalation. The tension was palpable. One false move could mean instant death. Prolonged submersion is as much a psychological trial as a mechanical one. Commanders are to maintain strict discipline. Panic undermines oxygen management and operational effectiveness. The vessel itself becomes a threat as much as the enemy above. Hardigan's log that evening was a grim record of endurance. The crew's fortitude is being tested beyond previous experience. Men exhibit signs of cognitive fatigue, irritability, and claustrophobia. No enemy engagement, yet survival remains a daily trial. The iron cage closes from all sides. By May 5. The men were counting the days, not in hours, but in breaths. Every sound, every vibration, became amplified in their consciousness. A cough from the engine room could spark anxiety throughout the boat. Lights were dimmed to preserve power and maintain calm, but the darkness made the corridors feel longer, the walls closer. Rations were carefully metered. Each swallow of water or bite of food was considered not just for nourishment but for energy conservation. Even the act of speaking carried weight. Unnecessary words were discouraged. The psychological toll of such confinement cannot be overstated. One crewman, unable to cope, banged his head against a bulkhead until restrained. Another muttered about ghosts and shadowed corridors. Each incident was a reminder that the iron cage was relentless, that the Atlantic beneath could crush the mind as surely as the sea could crush the hull. By May 6, the crew had adapted to a fragile equilibrium. Each man had settled into routines that balanced vigilance with survival. The boat itself, though exhausted, had become almost a living entity. Responsive, demanding, unforgiving. Hardigan reflected in his log. A submarine submerged for days is a test of human will as much as engineering. The walls press inward, the air thins, yet we endure. Each day is an exercise in patience, each breath a victory. The Atlantic above remained indifferent. Rain streaked the surface, wind whipped the waves, but beneath it all, U-123 persisted. The crew understood that survival was not guaranteed by skill alone, but by the ability to outlast fear itself. The submarine's interior had become a pressure cooker, not from the ocean above, but from the very air they breathed. By May 7, the oxygen concentration aboard U-123 had dropped to a perilous 18%, while carbon dioxide had crept above 1.5% levels that caused headaches, fatigue, and a creeping sense of disorientation. Every man was acutely aware of each inhale, each exhale, the stale air tangibly heavier with every passing hour. Oberleutnant Reinhard Hardigan moved slowly through the boat, eyes scanning the instruments, listening to the subtle vibrations of machinery. The batteries were holding, but only just. The diesel engines could not be run without surfacing, which was out of the question. Every system depended on the crew's restraint and the careful management of air. Air quality aboard U-boats must be monitored continuously. CO2 scrubbers are effective for limited periods. Battery-powered ventilation systems are to be conserved. Prolonged submersion requires strict rationing of activity and careful monitoring of crew behavior. Panic is lethal. By May 8, the physiological effects of low oxygen and high CO2 became unavoidable. Crewmen reported dizziness and blurred vision. Simple tasks, pulling levers, monitoring gauges, adjusting ballast tanks, required extraordinary concentration. Even speaking could induce lightheadedness. Hoffman, responsible for the control room instruments, paused and gripped the rail. His voice trembled as he reported to Hardigan. CO, 2 levels, rising faster than predicted. Men are showing signs of fatigue beyond normal operational stress. Hardigan did not flinch. His own head throbbed slightly, a subtle reminder of the air's degradation. Adjust the scrubbers. Limit activity to essential duties. Keep the men calm. No panic, he said. His tone was calm but firm. Any hint of fear from the commander could cascade into disaster for the entire crew. Reports indicate increasing survival rates for U-boat crews who remained submerged during heavy convoy patrols, though crew performance deteriorated with extended underwater exposure. Oxygen depletion and CO2 buildup noted as limiting factors in sustained operations. The crew adapted, moving in slow, deliberate patterns to conserve oxygen. Even minor actions, climbing ladders, opening hatches, lifting equipment were rationed. Conversations were held in whispers. Any laughter, any sudden movement was discouraged. Sleep came in fragmented intervals, 15 to 20 minutes at a time, leaving many men in a perpetual state of groggy alertness. Small rituals emerged as coping mechanisms. One sailor meticulously cleaned his station with a rag, wiping down metal surfaces until they gleamed. Another rearranged tools in precise, repetitive patterns. These behaviors, though seemingly trivial, helped maintain a fragile sense of control in an environment designed to strip it away. There is a threshold where the air itself becomes an enemy. Breathing feels like an effort against invisible resistance. Thoughts scatter, concentration falters. You realize that even the simplest action could jeopardize the boat and your life. By May 9, the physical symptoms were compounded by psychological strain. Crewmen complained of headaches, nausea, and tightness in the chest. Some displayed mild confusion, forgetting routine procedures or misreading gauges. Hardigan instituted strict monitoring, assigning one officer to observe the men's condition continuously. "Record any irregularities immediately," he instructed. "Do not underestimate the danger. Our enemies are both above and within these walls." The periscope, rarely raised due to the threat of Allied radar, became a symbol of restraint. Each opportunity to check the surface had to be balanced against the risk of detection and the need to preserve air. Every decision was a calculus of survival, requiring a blend of discipline, courage, and luck. Symptoms of low oxygen and high CO2 include headaches, nausea, disorientation, and eventual loss of consciousness. Commanders must enforce rationing of activity, maintain calm, and monitor all crew for signs of cognitive decline. Surface only when tactical necessity outweighs risk. On May 10, the crew's endurance was tested to the extreme. The scrubbers, devices designed to remove carbon dioxide from the air, were functioning at maximum efficiency, but could not keep pace with the crew's cumulative respiration. Oxygen tanks were rationed. Any exertion accelerated the depletion rate. Schmidt, now visibly pale, hesitated while adjusting a ballast valve. He felt lightheaded, the bulkhead spinning slightly as he held onto it. Hoffman noticed immediately. "Breathe slowly, one task at a time." Even the simple act of climbing the ladder from the torpedo room to the control room became an ordeal. Sweat beaded on brows, muscles trembled, and the heavy, stale air made every movement feel like lifting a weight several times greater than reality. Captured U-boat logs indicate extended submerged patrols caused crew fatigue, oxygen depletion, and operational delays. Commanders often prioritized remaining undetected over immediate engagement, even when resources were critically low. The irony of submarine warfare was painfully evident. Remaining submerged preserved life in the short term but threatened it in the long. Air ran thin. Every breath carried both sustenance and danger. Every decision was measured against the invisible, suffocating presence of the atmosphere itself. Hardigan paced the control room, his own face pale, lips dry. He reviewed the maps of Allied convoy routes, noting patterns of air patrols, destroyer sweeps, and sonar coverage. Surfacing was impossible without certain death. Remaining underwater was a gamble with slowly degrading odds. He called the crew together for a brief assembly. "We endure," he said. "We follow procedure. We breathe slowly, move carefully, and trust the boat. Every hour underwater is an hour survived." The men nodded, their expressions a mixture of fear, resolve, and exhaustion. They were aware of the paradox. Survival demanded stillness and silence, yet the very act of breathing made each second a threat. By late May 10, the cumulative effects were past of silence, undeniable. Crewmen experienced dizziness, tremors, and mild hallucinations. One sailor mistook the hum of the electric motor for enemy propellers. Another swore he heard voices from the bulkhead. Hardigan enforced strict routines, reminding the men that perception was often more dangerous than reality. The Atlantic remained indifferent. Storms churned the surface, but beneath, the iron cage persisted. Men clung to hope, routines, and each other's discipline. The air they breathed was finite, yet it carried the essence of survival, binding them to the mission and to the submarine itself. The submarine moved like a shadow in the deep, every maneuver deliberate, every creak of the hull a potential alarm to the enemy above. Silent running was not merely a tactic, it was a way of life, a psychological state where sound, motion, and even breathing were weaponized against detection. Oberleutnant Reinhard Hardigan understood that the Atlantic was alive with hunters. Allied destroyers equipped with sonar prowled the surface, their ears attuned to the faintest mechanical signature. Aircraft skimmed the waves, radar sweeping the skies and sea alike. A single misstep, the turning of a valve, the inadvertent clank of a tool could betray the boat's location. And yet, the men had to survive, manage air, and maintain operational readiness. Silent running shall be employed whenever enemy forces are within detection range. All auxiliary machinery is to be powered down. Movement within the vessel is to be minimized. Crew must remain stationary unless assigned to essential tasks. Breathing must be controlled. Noise discipline is paramount. The practice of silent running required an extraordinary synchronization of discipline and instinct. Crewmen learned to move as shadows, to communicate with gestures, whispers, or the flick of a light. The control room became the nerve center, where Hardigan and his officers listened intently to sonar echoes, reading the ocean's subtle language. Oberleutnant Hoffmann, stationed at the hydrophone array, strained to interpret the faintest sounds. Every ping of sonar or distant propeller wash was catalogued, compared against known patterns of convoy escorts. He whispered his assessments to Hardigan, who absorbed each fragment of information, calculating the likelihood of detection. U-boat crews practicing extended submerged operations report heightened anxiety and hyper-awareness. The constant vigilance required to avoid detection contributes to cumulative stress, exacerbating the physiological effects of low oxygen and elevated CO2. The psychological toll of these hours was immense. Crewmen experienced heightened senses and sharp focus, followed by sudden lapses and fatigue. Sleep remained a fragmented luxury, often interrupted by the subtle groan of the hull or the distant hum of a passing aircraft. Hardigan enforced strict rotations to ensure that men did not collapse from exhaustion, yet even brief naps carried risk. One careless movement in sleep could compromise stealth. The boat's depth varied subtly, adjusted by Hardigan to minimize sonar reflection. Every adjustment to ballast tanks, every fin correction, was calculated to maintain a balance between operational stealth and crew safety. Too shallow, and the propellers might be picked up by surface sonar. Too deep, and oxygen levels could drop precipitously. In the torpedo room, Kapitänleutnant's orders kept the crew in tense anticipation. Although U-123 had not yet engaged enemy vessels on this patrol, the threat of encounter was constant. Torpedoes were armed, checked, and rechecked. Even the slightest vibration of the boat could ripple through the tubes, making careful handling critical. Silent running is not merely about evasion, it is about controlling every aspect of life aboard the boat. Each breath, each step, each action must be measured. Any lapse, however minor, can have catastrophic consequences. The Atlantic is both ally and adversary in this game. By May 12, the men had perfected a rhythm, an unspoken choreography of survival. The engine room operated at a whisper, electric motors humming with restrained power. Ventilation was minimized to conserve oxygen and reduce mechanical noise. Even water pumps and hydraulic systems were modulated to avoid alerting sonar arrays above. Despite the tense calm, moments of vulnerability remained. A sudden burst of bubbles from a minor leak in the ballast tanks prompted a rapid assessment. Hoffmann traced the issue and reported, "Temporary. No hull breach. CO2, scrubbers absorbing. No risk of detection." The relief was palpable but fleeting. Each day submerged sharpened awareness and deepened fatigue. Mental strain compounded physiological stress, creating a delicate balance between efficiency and breakdown. Surviving crewmen of U-boat patrols reported that prolonged silent running required extraordinary mental discipline. Crew coordination and calm under duress were decisive factors in whether the submarine survived multiple days submerged. By May 13, Hardigan made the calculated decision to change course slightly, threading between reported convoy positions. The submarine's sonar picked up distant echoes of destroyers and cargo ships, their rhythmic propellers a constant reminder of the danger above. Every adjustment to depth, angle, or speed was considered in relation to both detection risk and crew endurance. Tension was both omnipresent and invisible. Crewmen spoke minimally, even in the privacy of their bunks. Thoughts of home and future became fleeting distractions, replaced by the immediate calculus of survival: conserve air, avoid detection, manage stress, maintain operational readiness. We learned to exist in a state where time lost all meaning. Hours merged into days. The concept of day and night disappeared beneath the waves. Your world was the submarine and the thin line of air you breathed. You became aware of every sound, every vibration, every breath. Hardigan conducted periodic checks, observing his men for signs of panic, confusion, or physical collapse. Even small mistakes could cascade into life-threatening situations. One sailor, fatigued and light-headed, fumbled with a hatch. A sharp reprimand and a gentle guiding hand restored order. But the event underscored the razor-thin margin between survival and catastrophe. The crew's coordination became almost telepathic. A glance, a subtle hand motion, or a brief nod communicated tasks that words could not risk conveying. Silent running demanded both unity and individual self-control. Failure in either could mean detection, destruction, or death. By May 14, 4 continuous days of submerged operations had taken their toll. Oxygen levels were lower, CO2 higher, and every man aboard the U-123 felt the invisible weight of the ocean pressing in. Yet discipline held firm. The crew understood that panic was the real enemy, more lethal than the depth or the enemy patrols above. Hardigan allowed himself a brief survey through the periscope during a fleeting lull, glimpsing grey Atlantic waves rolling under overcast skies. The surface seemed almost alien, distant, and treacherous. For now, it remained a forbidden space, a reminder that every breath underwater was both a gamble and a lifeline. The submarine had become a sealed world, a metallic cocoon suspended beneath the waves. The diesel engines were long silenced. Electric motors hummed softly, constrained by necessity. The Atlantic pressed from all sides, a grey, unyielding expanse, and inside, the crew of U-123 began to feel the invisible, cumulative weight of confinement. Every breath was measured, every movement deliberate. Oberleutnant Reinhard Hardigan prowled the control room, eyes scanning instruments, ears tuned to the faintest echo of sonar. The readings were clear. Enemy destroyers and patrol aircraft still patrolled the area. Any sign of noise or surface activity could bring death. The men were acutely aware of the danger, but another threat loomed, one invisible, inexorable, and insidious: the deteriorating quality of the air within the submarine. Submerged operations exceeding 72 hours require careful monitoring of oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. CO2 scrubbers must be maintained and checked every 4 hours. Crew respiration rates must be monitored. Symptoms of hypoxia or CO2 poisoning include headaches, confusion, shortness of breath, and in severe cases, unconsciousness or death. By May 15, the air was thick with carbon dioxide. The chemical scrubbers laboured to remove it, but even at peak efficiency, the oxygen content had dropped to levels that made physical exertion hazardous. Crewmen became sluggish, hands trembled, thoughts wandered in dangerous loops. Hardigan, aware of the insidious nature of these symptoms, increased observation rounds, noting each sailor's demeanour, breathing, and response to stress. Oberleutnant Hoffmann, stationed at the hydrophone, reported fatigue creeping into the men. "Some are light-headed," he murmured, keeping his voice low. "The CO2 is rising faster than expected. If this continues..." His words hung in the air, unfinished but heavy with implication. Extended missions in confined cockpits produced psychological fatigue, impaired judgment, and slowed reflexes. Coordination within small crews was critical to mission survival. While the U-boat's environment differed from a cockpit, the principle was the same. Survival depended on a delicate balance of mental fortitude, coordination, and careful management of resources. Any misstep, any lapse in concentration, could prove fatal. Hardigan convened a brief meeting with his senior officers. The mood was tense but disciplined. They discussed options: surface at night to refresh air, risk detection, or remain submerged and rely entirely on the scrubbers and their own discipline. Each alternative carried a grave cost. Every hour on the surface is a gamble with Allied patrols, Hardigan reminded them. Every hour submerged risks the limits of endurance. We must continue silent running until the immediate threat has passed, but we cannot ignore the air. You could feel the air change. Your chest felt tight, and thinking became slow. Every sound in the boat seemed amplified, every cough or sigh a betrayal. We knew the surface meant exposure, but the air below was slowly turning against us too. By May 16, oxygen levels had dropped enough to affect cognitive function. Simple calculations became difficult, routine maintenance slowed. Even hardened veterans experienced a creeping sense of unreality, a subtle detachment from immediate surroundings. Hardigan maintained strict discipline, emphasizing that calm, methodical action remained the key to survival. Despite the danger, the crew's training showed remarkable resilience. They executed all maneuvers with precision, checked torpedo tubes, and monitored depth and course, though the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The very act of breathing became conscious, a reminder of vulnerability. Each Type 2A U-boat is equipped with lithium hydroxide canisters capable of maintaining safe CO2 levels for 72-96 hours at normal crew activity. Excess exertion reduces efficiency. Extended submerged operations beyond design limits are considered high risk and require constant monitoring. By May 17, the limitations of these systems were clear. Crewmen were fatigued. Some exhibited headaches and mild disorientation. Even minor errors in procedure could compromise survival. Every creak of the hull, every shift of ballast, every movement of a body became a calculated risk. In the control room, Hardigan and Hoffman monitored depth and bearing, listening intently for the distant propeller wash of Allied ships. Each echo was assessed, catalogued, and compared with prior intelligence. The Atlantic was an unfeeling adversary, but enemy patrols were the immediate threat, and exhaustion made discernment more difficult. Submerged endurance is not only a function of machinery and fuel, but of human physiology. Crews, exposed to sustained low oxygen, high CO, two environments experience impaired judgment, reduced reaction times, and cumulative psychological stress, which can be fatal in combat conditions. Hardigan understood this well. He instituted short periods of controlled physical activity to maintain circulation and mental clarity, balancing exertion against oxygen consumption. He rotated crew positions, ensuring that the most fatigued men were given minimal responsibility until alertness returned. Even as the days dragged on, the men's awareness remained razor-sharp, though fragile. Every sound became significant. Every vibration could signal detection. Trust in one another and in procedure was paramount. A single lapse could trigger a cascade of errors, imperiling the entire boat. The Atlantic above was mercilessly grey. Submarine periscopes remained below the waves, a rare glimpse of the hostile world that existed beyond steel walls. Every surface reconnaissance carried risk. Every deep dive was a silent prayer to endurance. The men communicated in whispers, gestures, or subtle lights. The cabin remained still, alive only with the low hum of machinery, the creak of metal, and the rhythmic intake of breath. In this crucible, individuality faded into collective effort. Survival required both discipline and mutual reliance. By the fourth day submerged, every decision carried weight. You measured not just strategy, but life itself, air, stamina, mental clarity. Each man became a gauge, each action a calculation. The Atlantic demanded respect, the enemy demanded vigilance, and the boat demanded complete unity. On May 17, A subtle shift in currents allowed a brief reduction in depth, decreasing pressure on the hull, providing minor relief. The crew seized the opportunity for checks and adjustments, monitoring air and CO2 levels carefully. Even small improvements were a boon, sustaining morale and providing the energy needed to continue the precarious mission. By the seventh day beneath the waves, the U-123 had become a vessel of tension, its crew oscillating between discipline and despair. Every breath drew in heavier air, every movement drew focus and energy. The diesel engines remained silent, the surface a distant, dangerous promise. The Atlantic above was a grey, indifferent expanse, hiding both freedom and death. Oberleutnant Heinemann faced the impossible calculus of command. Surfacing risked detection by Allied destroyers and aircraft, an almost certain death sentence, but remaining submerged meant testing human endurance to its limit. Crewmen experienced dizziness, headaches, and shortness of breath. Minor mistakes in routine checks could cascade into disaster. Oberleutnant Hoffmann adjusted the scrubbers, monitoring lithium hydroxide canisters. The chemical reaction had slowed, and carbon dioxide levels had begun to creep toward critical thresholds. The men's faces betrayed exhaustion, their discipline stretched taut. Yet there was no mutiny, no despair that could manifest openly. Each man understood the stakes. Survival depended on unity, trust, and absolute obedience. Historical records from Kriegsmarine post-action reports emphasized this tension. Submerged endurance was less a measure of machinery than of human psychology. U-boat crews had to balance fear, patience, and courage, often for days on end while confined within steel walls, hearing only the distant groan of waves and the hum of electric motors. In the control room, Hardeggen's eyes swept the men, reading every subtle cue. "Stay focused. Every action counts," he said, his voice a calm anchor. They nodded, performing the necessary checks with mechanical precision. The Atlantic above remained silent, and yet it seemed to press inward, as if the sea itself sought to test their limits. That night, whispers of desperation threaded through the compartments, men wondering if they could endure much longer, questioning the thin line between courage and survival instinct. Yet even in that shadow, discipline held. Each sailor inhaled slowly, checked instruments, and continued to operate with the precision that had kept them alive. The U-123 was more than a submarine. It was a crucible of human endurance, where the courage to remain submerged became a testament to both training and sheer willpower. The first light of dawn painted the horizon a muted grey, barely illuminating the restless waves above the submerged U-123. Inside the steel hull, every man was awake, alert, and yet exhausted. Days of submerged operations had taken their toll, skin pale, eyes sunken, movements slow but deliberate. The tension was almost tangible, a tight wire strung between survival and catastrophe. Oberleutnant Reinhard Hardeggen paced the control room, listening to the muffled creak of the hull and the faint echo of the electric motors. His decisions in the coming moments could mean life or death for every crewman. The tactical reports from BDU had emphasized prudence. Allied air and sea patrols were concentrated in the Bay of Biscay, making surface operations extremely hazardous. Yet remaining submerged for any longer risked carbon dioxide poisoning, hypoxia, and outright collapse of crew efficiency. The margins had narrowed to inches. Oberleutnant Hoffmann moved to the air scrubbers, checking the lithium hydroxide canisters one last time. Carbon dioxide levels had approached critical thresholds, and the men's laboured breathing was audible even over the hum of the submarine. Hardeggen nodded at Hoffmann. "Prepare to surface, slowly, watch for aircraft, keep the crew ready." Each man assumed his post with practiced precision. The deck hatch, usually a mundane element of routine, became a potential doorway to salvation or annihilation. The crew knew the procedure by heart, but nerves tightened muscles that had grown stiff from days of confinement. They moved silently, aware that any sound could betray their presence to Allied reconnaissance planes or patrolling destroyers. Historical records from Kriegsmarine operational logs note that surfacing after extended submerged endurance was an exercise in coordination, nerve, and timing. Sensors were checked. Periscopes lifted cautiously. The sea above appeared calm but untrustworthy, a deceptive mask over potential threats. Radar reports from the Allies had intensified in the area, signaling that the window for safe surfacing was perilously small. Hardigan gave the order. Slowly. Bring her up. Electric motors reversed, ballast tanks filled, and the steel Leviathan crept upward. Crewmen braced, listening for the hiss of compressed air and the groan of metal bending under pressure. Each second stretched endlessly, the Atlantic around them, indifferent yet threatening. When the hull finally breached the surface, the U-123 shuddered, taking in the full weight of air and light. The dawn revealed nothing immediate, no aircraft, no destroyers on the horizon. Relief swept silently through the crew, but discipline remained. Hardigan kept his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, scanning for threats, knowing the danger had not passed, merely shifted. The post-war interrogation of surviving U-boat officers often emphasized this delicate balance between relief and vigilance. Surfacing was not an act of triumph alone, it was a temporary reprieve from the crushing pressure of the deep. U-boat crews had learned that their survival depended as much on mental endurance as mechanical efficiency. Deck operations commenced with cautious efficiency. Crewmen vented batteries, recharged air compressors, and performed routine maintenance while maintaining watch rotations. Even in apparent safety, the shadow of the Bay of Biscay loomed, a reminder of both the thin line they had walked and the deadly ocean above. Hardigan allowed himself a moment to breathe, feeling the salty wind on his face. He recalled the days submerged, the rhythmic drone of the diesel engines replaced by oppressive silence, the slow suffocation of stale air, and the unyielding pressure of the Atlantic pressing from all sides. That memory, both haunting and instructive, underscored the resilience of the men under his command. Morale, though frayed, found a fragile renewal. Conversations in the control room were hushed, subdued by the lingering awareness of danger, yet there was camaraderie, mutual recognition of endurance and skill. They had survived a trial. Few could imagine a submerged endurance test not mandated by choice, but by necessity. The U-123, once merely a vessel of war, had become a crucible in which human courage, endurance, and tactical discipline were fused under extreme conditions. Kriegsmarine reports later praised Hardigan's judgment and the crew's cohesion, noting that surfacing after extended submerged operations without incident was a rare feat. Allied records corroborated the precariousness of these maneuvers, highlighting that U-boat losses in the Bay of Biscay had spiked during 1943 precisely because many crews failed to maintain composure, discipline, or timing during surfacing attempts. The Atlantic remained a grave, indifferent to human struggle. Yet for the crew of U-123, the dawn had brought fragile triumph, a temporary, hard-won victory over the invisible, crushing enemy that lay beneath the waves. Their survival was not a testament to luck alone, but to meticulous training, unyielding discipline, and the sheer will to endure when every instinct cried for escape. Hardigan watched the horizon, aware that this moment of relative safety was ephemeral. The war continued, the Allies adapted, and the ocean offered no promises. Yet within the steel hull of the U-123, the crew had endured what few others could, a submerged odyssey of fear, courage, and endurance that would define both the men and the ruthless logic of underwater warfare. The wind shifted. A distant gull cried, and the Atlantic, vast and merciless, reminded them once more that survival beneath its waves was never guaranteed, but that, for now, they had cheated it. The first light of dawn painted the horizon a muted grey, barely illuminating the restless waves above the submerged U-123. Inside the steel hull, every man was awake, alert, and yet exhausted. Days of submerged operations had taken their toll. Skin pale, eyes sunken, movements slow but deliberate. The tension was almost tangible, a tight wire strung between survival and catastrophe.